My two guests today are Bernard Schutz, who is a member of the US National Academy of Sciences and of 3 other distinguished academies. He is Professor of Physics and Astronomy in the Gravity Exploration Institute at Cardiff University, UK, Emeritus Director and Founding Director of the Max Planck Institute for Gravitational Physics, the Albert Einstein Institute in Germany, and a former director and founding director of Cardiff's Data Innovation Research Institute. He has worked for more than 35 years on gravitational wave detection and played a key role in developing the science case that led to funding of the LIGO, Virga, and CAGRA detector network. He also led the science team of the proposal for the LISA space-based gravitational wave detector, stepping down when the mission was adopted recently by the European Space Agency. Bernard Schutz has served in multiple advisory positions to the European Space Agency's Science Division, is author or co-author of over 450 research papers and 3 textbooks, and founded the Living Reviews family of journals. And he serves on the editorial board of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He has an honorary doctorate from Glasgow University, is an adjunct professor at Georgia Institute of Technology, and is the recipient of a number of medals and awards. Bernard, welcome. My other guest is Joe Ingram. Joe is chairman of Capitalis Partners / Green Tech Labs, a South African private equity group dedicated to investments in biotechnology and renewable energy waste management. He is a former president and CEO of the North-South Institute and a former World Bank special representative to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. He is also a regular opinion writer to Canadian newspapers, The Hill Times and iPolitics. Following a 30-year career at the World Bank, which included directing World Bank resident missions in the Balkans and Sub-Saharan Africa, he consulted for the Canadian government, the UN Human Rights Council, and the World Trade Organization. He is an expert advisor to the Washington-based The Global Growth Dialogue and is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He studied at McMaster University and at the Harvard Business School, and he is a resident of Italy. Joe, welcome to you as well. Now,
thank you, Nick.
Gentlemen, you both wrote a powerful piece for iPolitics last year about the dangerous delusions of climate change denial. And I wondered if you'd both start by telling me how you came to write that paper and indeed adopt that position. Joe, perhaps I could start with you.
Well, thank you, Nick. I think it obviously started, we're neighbors, so in discussions socially, we understood that we both had a common concern over global warming and its impact on our societies, our economies, the planet. So that was a start. And then I think we recognized that we had in a sense, a complementary skill set, or skill sets, and complementary experiences. Bernard as a scientist, and me as a public policy economist, and somebody who had spent much of their career also involved in research. I didn't put it in the bio, but I spent 5 years with the International Development Research Center as their representative in the field of population and health sciences in the Middle East and North Africa. Before I joined the World Bank. And then subsequently worked with the World Bank on public policies. And I think we both came to the conclusion that a solution to the threat of global warming requires both, in a sense, the technological solutions, plus the policy choices, technological solutions, especially in the short term, and the policy choices, and the political will, very important, the political will to implement implement those choices and to utilize the technological solutions that science and technology come up with. So I think, in a sense, as I said, there was a natural fit. We decided that it would be perhaps effective to bring both points of view to bear in a single piece.
Thank you. And Bernard, how about you?
Well, I think Joe has described it very well. From my point of view as a scientist, the science of global warming isn't in doubt, and so in the circle that I move in normally, we talk about it a lot, but it's like talking to the converted, and you're in a bubble a bit, because clearly in the political sphere, the message hasn't sunk in everywhere. So what attracted me to working with Joe was Joe was able to give me a voice to the political side in a respected publication, and be able to help me talk with people, or talk at least if somebody's listening, that are not just my scientifics here.
And Bernard, obviously you're talking to us from your Italian home as well. Joe lives in Italy too. Is that how you both met? Or was it through some other connection that you came to conjoin on this issue?
No, we're neighbors. We can see our houses across the valley, and we move in the same social circle. So we knew each other for quite a long time before the idea occurred to us that, you know, from just talking socially with each other about our concerns, the idea was hatched to actually combine forces and do something like writing the article.
Well, the piece that you both wrote for iPolitics was certainly an impassioned and powerful indictment, really, of where we are at the moment on the whole global warming issue. Joe, can I turn to you and ask if you could sketch out a sort of, at least in part, the severity of the threat as you see it? And then, Bernard, if I could then follow up with you to put some overlay on that as well. So, Joe, to you first.
Well, it's interesting you raised the question, because today when I turned on the news, CNN and BBC, the news headlines today, the first items were about the severity of the two hurricanes, which are unprecedented, really, two hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast of the United States. And at the same time, on the same report, the fact that many families in California are actually considering moving elsewhere in the United States because of these massive fires this week. And they're very concerned that this is likely to become, or is becoming, the new normal in California. So, and with the projections on flooding that the weather people are talking about in the Gulf, in Texas and Louisiana, I think it was pretty graphic today on CNN what the threat is indeed very real and is affecting more and more people in the United States. Also, I think recently a friend of mine, a former colleague at the World Bank, who is now a professor at Lee Kuan Yew University in Singapore, he's a former vice president also of the Asian Development Bank, sent me a copy of a study which he and an academic colleague in the US and another one in Chile recently completed. It's an econometric study linking global warming directly to a very strong methodology. It's very well researched, very well done, to linking global warming to the increased frequency and severity of hydrometeorological events. They looked at data over the past 46 years in 155 different countries. And the link is extremely strong. The findings are very robust from a methodological point of view, showing that indeed the rising temperatures are having a profound impact on both the frequency and severity of hydrometeorological events. And certainly people in the Gulf states and in the southeastern states in the United States and in California are feeling feeling the results. There was also a study done recently, and it was quoted actually in the New York Times last week, on the warming of tropical soils. There was always it was a prevailing view that because of the canopy and the forest cover in the tropics, in the Amazon, and in tropical sub-Saharan Africa, that the soil temperatures would remain relatively constant. But of course, with deforestation and the rising average global temperature, and certainly temperatures rising in that part of the world, the soils, tropical soils in the forests are indeed heating up rather quickly, rather much more than they expected they would. And this is, of course, releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, including methane, and will accelerate considerably, they think, the warming of the planet by contributing to GHGs in the atmosphere. So that is a worrying finding that was just released. Now, when you also consider that in 2019, 2018 were I think the two hottest years on record, we'll see what the average temperature is for 2020, and that in California this year, as you know, they registered the highest temperature ever recorded, 54.4 Celsius, which exceeded 54 degrees, which was registered earlier this year. I think it was in Iraq, and that in the Arctic this year, you've got record temperatures of 38 degrees Celsius, which is the hottest temperature ever recorded. We have cause for concern. Now, we also, what makes it even more concerning is that this is on a planet where the average global temperature has risen by only 1 degree Celsius since the Paris Accords. And studies have shown that if countries undertake transformations, which they have committed to doing in the 2015, as part of the targets they set in Paris, up until 2050, those were the targets. In the interim, the average temperature could rise to 3.5, could rise from 1 to 3.5 degrees Celsius. Some are even suggesting higher. And these are temperatures which are well beyond the 1.5 degrees, some say 2 degrees, considered a tipping point beyond which, of course, irreparable damage would be done. Finally, I think what is concerning is that in Hawaii this year, where they have sensors which measure the amount of GHGs, CO2 in the atmosphere, they recorded a measurement of 417 parts per million CO2 this year. That is the highest ever recorded. And they go back through they can, I don't know how they do it, I'm not a specialist, Bernard might know, but they said this could be the hottest in 3 million years. I guess they look at ice samples and other natural objects. But that is very worrisome. Also, when you consider that in 1958, it was 315 parts per million. So the amount of GHGs measured in the atmosphere are really quite worrisome and indicative of how severe the situation is. So there's every chance we could see, as a result of this, not by 2050, well before that, extensive areas of the planet become uninhabitable to humans, as in California today, and as in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and possibly in the Gulf Coast as well. So the severity is clearly evident in the data, and the data is from multiple sources and measuring multiple things, but they all reach the conclusion that we're really in a very serious situation.
Bernard, is there anything that you'd like to add to that threat assessment from Joe?
I completely agree with everything Joe said, and the numbers are very worrying. I'd like to try to zoom out and take a bit of perspective on this, which is also very worrying. The physics of what happens to the atmosphere when carbon dioxide content goes up is elementary. It's something you can demonstrate in a high school physics class. It's nothing difficult, and it's inevitable. People who say that there are other causes of global warming would still have to explain why the carbon dioxide that's in the air is not causing the global warming that we see. So the global warming is due to the carbon dioxide, and it's an elementary thing. The methane that Joe mentioned is a much stronger greenhouse gas and has an effect that only makes things worse. And to the extent that methane is coming into the atmosphere from the tropics, but also from the defrosting of the tundra in the Arctic because of these really, really high temperatures in the Arctic, that will have an accelerating effect on global temperatures. Now, at the same time, the Earth is a very complicated system. The Earth's atmosphere is a very complicated system. My background is in astrophysics. I'm not a specialist in atmospheric science, Earth's atmosphere science, but I do study similar systems in terms of the stars and how they transport heat and things like that. And in astrophysics, we know very well that we have limited data about systems. We can make certain conclusions about them very reliably if we don't try to get into great detail about the distribution. So we understand a huge amount about the sun, but we can't predict where the next sunspot is going to be, for example. So there are and average properties of things, but you may not be able to predict in a very complicated system like the sun or like the Earth's atmosphere. You may not be able to predict everything that's going on. And I think the problem, the political problem, comes in a sense from that. People who want to deny or want to avoid or delay action can always point to things that are not understood about the effects of global warming in detail, exactly how it's going to affect any continent's weather. Sometimes comes as a surprise. And yet it's inexorable because the global forcing of it is going to produce inevitable consequences, even if you can't predict exactly how many years. And if you go back to the beginning of the IPCC, they were very well aware of the fact that they knew some things very well, and they didn't know a lot of the, couldn't predict in a lot of detail. Their prognostications, what they told the governments in their initial reports, tended to be on the conservative side. And the reason they were on the conservative side was that they didn't want to go so far out on a limb and make some kind of prediction that some naysayer might pick up and say, well, you got this wrong, you got that wrong. And so we shouldn't believe anything that you're saying. The conflating of the detail with the overall inevitability of the global. And so they tended to be conservative. If you look back at those predictions and you compare where we are today, things are much worse. Things are happening much faster. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because that was their error room. They gave themselves more room for error on the side of things getting worse faster because of the political considerations. And unfortunately, that's where we are. So in the beginning, they were talking about, well, this will happen by the end of the 21st century. The things that they were talking about happening by the end of the 21st century, we may see in the next 20 years, 30 years. And things that maybe not as bad as those things, but still on the road, we may see in the next 10 years. So I'm alarmed, and that's why we wrote so robustly about this problem, because we felt that there's no time anymore for niggling about details. We can see the evidence all over the place. Even if we don't know exactly what's going to happen in 5 years, we know it's going to be worse than today, and it's going to be getting worse faster and faster unless we do something. And as the statistics that Joe quoted showed, we've done very little since the IPCC came in. Clearly, there's been no sense of urgency in the international community. And so we wanted to say it's time to totally switch and understand that this is an urgent problem and things are very close to being out of control. And we may not be able to stop ourselves crossing that tipping point, no matter what we do anymore, because of the methane that's creeping out of the ground. And that tipping point, let's face it, is a place where big social disruptions may happen, and we may see very uncomfortable rises in sea levels, and that may be now inevitable. And so part of what we are saying is also, don't just address the causes of global warming. That is, obviously we want to stop putting carbon in the air, but we need to address the mitigation that we're going to have to do. We need to address the problems that are going to come up, that are going to force people to want to leave where they live and migrate. We should be addressing the technologies that may help mitigate these problems as well. So not just put our heads in the sand, but actually say, there are going to be these big problems. We have to be able to address them technologically as well.
Well, before we turn to the question of action and what you both see as a pathway to, progress on defeating this threat, since we're blessed, Bernard, with having an astrophysicist in our midst here, I wondered whether you might sketch out, or indeed knock on the head, the idea that the CO2, in a sense, in the atmosphere is irrelevant compared to cyclical warming of the planet from the sun. Is that an argument that has any validity from an astrophysicist's point of view, or is it worthless?
That's a pretty worthless argument from my point of view. You just have to look at the rate of change of things, the dramatic change in temperatures that we've seen in global average temperatures. That's never been seen through the cyclic effects of the sun. We have a lot of information about the history of the atmosphere, as Joe referred to. Ice cores, Greenland ice cores, and cores taken elsewhere as well. But air gets trapped in the ice when it snows, and then the ice forms out of that snow year after year. As more layers of snow are laid down, air is trapped in those formations of ice. And when you take the cores out, you get the composition of the air. And the composition tells you not just how much carbon dioxide there may be, but it tells you a lot about the temperature. You may get spores of plants. There's some plants that only are going to put out spores when the temperature is in a certain range. So you learn a lot about the atmosphere. We can reconstruct the atmosphere quite well. And it's an amazing amount of science that these specialists who do that are able to do. There's what's happening now is unprecedented. It's simply unprecedented.
Can I add, Nick, to just a point?
Go ahead, Joe.
Comment on what Bernard said earlier and what you said. I find it striking, very striking, that and I'm watching these conventions here, or in the United States, here in Italy, and I found it striking that during the first 2 days of the Republican convention, not one person mentioned either the fires in California. Well, that's not fair. Melania Trump expressed concern for people, but nobody mentioned the global warming as a contributing factor, nor the impact that these hurricanes, or this hurricane is likely to have in the Gulf Coast, and the fact that global warming could be a contributing factor. It just has not come up. It did, in fairness, in the Democratic National Convention. Obviously, they talked about the importance of a Green New Deal, or whatever they're going to call it. But there was no mention of it at all. It's as if it hasn't been happening, which is sad and reflects where the minds of these political leaders are today. It's not just in the United States, I might add.
No, indeed. Well, given the severity of the threat as you've both laid it out, I wonder what you would have governments do about this. What action are you both proposing that governments and, for that matter, industry and academia take to solve this problem?
Well, we're saying that this isn't a normal problem. Governments should not look to the private sector, should not just look at what laws they can pass to make things happen. They should regard this as a challenge of the same magnitude as if they were entering a war. If they were attacked by something, by another country, they wouldn't go to the private sector and ask for the problem to be solved, and maybe some new weapons, or maybe raise some private armies, and let's fight off this enemy through the capitalist system and the private sector. That wouldn't be the response of any sane country. And we are in a life-threatening position. Globally, we are at war with the changes in our atmosphere. And we need to have a mindset which is similar to what happens when a country goes into a war situation. They have to go onto a war footing. You don't count your pennies. You put money into development of new technologies, into the distribution of existing technologies, and you leave till later worrying about the accounting of things, because if you don't do that, you're not going to have the money you thought you had later on anyway.
Yeah, Joe, would you like to add?
Yeah, as Bernard said, we are effectively at war with warming and with the symptoms of warming, and as we are with COVID. Okay, and the effort that's been made to deal with COVID is massive. It's unprecedented in terms of public resources being committed to fighting COVID. And the failure to defeat, if I can use the war analogy, global warming will kill many, many more than COVID. And it will potentially render much of the planet uninhabitable. And perhaps well before 2050 if we're not careful. And as Bernard said, the threat, it requires not only the technological solutions that he referred to, which in turn require massive funding on a war footing, as he said, both public and private, by the way. There's got to be public-private partnerships. But the effort needs to be directed, and if I can use this concept, by internationally coordinated national strategies. And it will require, which in turn will require significant changes, I think systemic changes, and we're perhaps getting ahead of ourselves in the discussion, but significant changes to the ways in which governments, and I would say as an economist, the ways in which the economics profession measures economic progress, okay? We measure what we treasure is a term that I've used a few times. And we measure what's important. Governments measure what they consider important. And of course, the principal metric that governments use globally, or have been using until today, is gross domestic product, growth in GDP. And that's an income metric. It's based on income. And that's what we use primarily to measure economic progress. And what we need to do, we have to go beyond income alone. And we need to measure indicators of sustainability, okay, of equity and social justice. Because obviously the poor and the more vulnerable are the people who are going to be most affected by the impact of global warming. People in drought-stricken regions of Africa are not only going to die, but as Bernard said earlier, they're going to migrate. They're going to be pushed into leaving and migrate. And to a point where we will have trouble managing these kinds of flows. They will have, their governments will have trouble, and our governments will have trouble. So these are the kinds of indicators that increasingly need to guide governments' policy choices and guide how scarce public resources are going to be prioritized. There are some governments that are already doing this, at least at the local level. Some state governments in the United States, not many, maybe 4 or 5, Maryland at one point, the city of Edmonton in Canada is looking at what they call genuine progress indicators, okay? And these are multidimensional. They're perhaps too many. They have as many as 17 indicators which they measure. But they encompass sustainability as well as equity and income. And I should add that the Chinese have developed something they call a gross ecosystem, measuring what they call gross ecosystem product, which is, again, a more complex set of indicators, which measures the cost of our technologies, the technologies we use, on the ecosystem, on the environment. So that has to change, and the economics profession has to be very much involved. You know, I won't go into the history of economics, but at one point they thought, they were like physicists, Bernard, that they could use concepts that, that came from physics and could be applied to economics, and suddenly, by doing that, it became a science. Well, and then too many have forgotten that it's a social science, that it's not you can't equate the two in terms of what you're measuring and how what you're measuring behaves. And so the other area I think that's important is what we consume and how we consume must be radically changed, I think. Since it's the major, consumption is the major contributor to global warming, is a major contributor to global warming. It also happens to be, and this is part of the dilemma, the major contributor to growth, economic growth, especially in the United States, where 71% of their GDP is generated from consumption. So, and if you look at, there's an interesting index, it's the Global Footprint Network, estimates that we are currently consuming at a rate of 1.7 times what the Earth's regenerative systems can sustain. 1.7 times what the Earth's regenerative systems can sustain. Any level above 1, according to scientists, means we are destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life on the planet. So there are major things that need to be changed in terms of government policy. And this is why we're at war, in fact. We're at war with ourselves in a way. And in a way, it's like in the case of COVID, as I said, where governments and the public sector are playing and need to play a preponderant role in both setting the strategy for dealing with COVID, funding the research and development into dealing with COVID, and the public services that will be increasingly required in a very differently structured economy. So, and I think what I'm saying is that in the case of global warming, we can no longer allow the fossil fuel corporations and their financiers to disproportionately determine government policy, especially fiscal policy and public policy choices. And they have played a disproportionate, a preponderant role, including in Canada, in my country, certainly in the United States, and no doubt in the UK. And I was just quoting to Bernard earlier, something I read recently, that the G20, and this is since 2015, the members of the G20 have pledged $151 billion of public money to fossil fuels, which represents 56% of the energy component of their post-COVID economic stimulus package. Okay, 56% of the energy package as part of the post-COVID stimulus package is going to fossil fuels. Now, keep in mind that the G20, of course, includes the United States, it includes India, it includes China, but the other interesting aspect of that is that it includes 92 gigawatts of new plants producing energy, 92 gigawatts coal-fired plants, okay, that have been built or are being built since the 2015 Paris Accords. So it really is a war, and it's going to require changes in the way government sets its priorities, what we measure, and how we measure things. So it's going to require some major restructuring.
Well, when we
the mindset has to change.
Yes, well, indeed. When we think of global warming as a threat and portray it in the threat that we're talking about it now, I can't, and I suspect many people can't help but be drawn back to where Europe in particular was on the eve of the Second World War. And as we know, as we were warned of war coming, nothing was done, and then we entered the most destructive conflict in human history. That war, of course, developed a lot of technologies. The growth of technological development was exponential during the 6 years of the Second World War. I wanted to turn now, if we could, to the kinds of technologies, if we can call them this, the wartime technologies that we are going to deploy against global warming. Bernard, could I start with you and ask, what sorts of technologies do you think we need to deploy against the global warming threat?
Well, the list is long, and the list includes things that many people are familiar with. It's not that we don't have any technologies, but even well-tried or well-understood technologies that are being deployed, like solar electric power and wind power, can benefit from investment in ways to make them more efficient and particularly solar electric, because many of the other technologies that I'll talk about in a minute depend upon clean energy inputs for them to be effective. And so the more energy we can generate that's clean and that's cheap, the easier and cheaper the other technologies will be for us to use. And so I think it's a key to get more efficient generation of energy through the methods we already know, but also to augment them. We have to understand hydrogen as a fuel, and we should be understanding and deploying geothermal sources of energy, and there are some ideas now out there for using geothermal in local regions, not just volcanic hotspots, but places where people just build houses and they can heat their houses using geothermal techniques. So there's many kinds of things that are out there, people are talking about, but there's, you know, to develop them, you need to get a venture capitalist, and then you have to show a possibility of a profit. But if the government intervenes in the way it went about, all the governments went about during wartime, funding new ideas that could pay off, then many of these things could become realities. So the energy generation I've talked about. I think a very high priority and very near term is direct air carbon capture. We're already removing carbon dioxide from smoke that's generated in power stations. That's called carbon capture. But we can also extract carbon dioxide out of the air, and if that's getting cheaper, and it has the possibility of getting cheap enough, for example, that you could make airline flights, civil airline flights, carbon free, carbon neutral, so that the carbon that they generate in flight, but with a small surcharge on the cost of a ticket, could be extracted from the air again, within some sort of plant that's on the ground somewhere else. The carbon goes into the air from the airplane, but the carbon comes out of the air somewhere else and is sequestered. And the goal to get that down would make a massive change in our perception of the environmental impacts of flight. So if that could be made efficient. But there's many other things besides that. There's desalination. We're going to have water shortages. We have a huge reservoir of water in the oceans. It's expensive to desalinate, but the energy cost is one of the main expenses. If we can make energy cheaper, we can make desalination cheaper. Clean energy, of course. We should be, and there is a huge effort already in the private sector and in the public sector to improve energy storage in the form of batteries. That's a really key technology. And I'm sure it would benefit from a lot more investment by governments, because the sun shines only part of the day, the wind blows only part of the day. If we want to use renewables, we need to be able to store the energy, and we can't do that yet. Efficient transport of electricity. So there are places where you could generate a lot of solar energy in the Sahara Desert, for example, but it's not near anybody who needs it. And so a more efficient transport of energy. And then I think about the impacts on people. If people are going to have to live in less hospitable climates, if they want to stay put, if they don't want to pick up their lives and migrate and find hostility the way migrants are finding hostility today, then we should be paying attention to technologies that can mitigate the problems that people have to deal with, extreme heat or, well, as we're seeing, storms, fires, and so on. Some of those things involve the internet. Some of those things involve communication. Some of those things involve, for instance, remote medical diagnosis and interventions and things like that. We should be addressing many of these problems that could be deployed to help people stay where they want to be. And there are the nuclear energy generation options. Plasma fusion has been taking very much longer than it was initially suggested, partly because the problem is physics of it is much more demanding and difficult, although there has been huge progress, but also partly because the investment from government has tailed off, is much less than it used to be. And so if fusion reactors are inherently clean and safe, that would be a huge benefit for backup power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So I think these are things that really need, and I could add many more things to the list, but that gives you some idea of the different directions in which investment could be beneficial. And most of these things really need government investment, because they're not the sorts of things that if you just go to the market and ask for venture capitalists to fund them, that you're going to get progress on the timescale that we need.
But it's interesting, Nick, just to underline Bernard's point, 2/3 of the global population today live in countries where renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. So the obvious question is, why aren't these investors, why aren't people coming in and developing them and investing in them? And when you consider that I mean, you read the headline in a recent Economist about the death of the petrostates. When you consider that companies, reinsurance, insurance companies, investors, etc., are divesting now, getting out of oil and gas, you need to wonder why governments aren't quicker off the mark and haven't picked up on the signals. Part of the problem is that they tend to be dominated by people who are closely linked to the vested interests. And so when people talk about investing in new renewable technologies, many of them talk about the need to build bridges to those new technologies. And we need we need fossil fuels to continue to be exploited, to serve as bridges to these renewables. This is a false argument and a very dangerous one. And unfortunately, in Canada, it's dominating a lot of the political discourse today. Now we'll see if things change with the recent change in government. But that is a major issue, and it's really quite surprising when you consider that, as I said, 2/3 of the world's population, that they live in countries where it's, and not just a little bit cheaper, considerably cheaper, and more efficient in many respects.
Joe, if I could stay with you for a moment. Bernard outlined, and there are, of course, a range of technological options that we have for tackling the problem. Some are at very low technological readiness levels, some are at high technological readiness levels. I wonder if you had any thoughts on how we prioritize in the development of a mix of technologies that can be deployed against global warming. Obviously, it's a global issue. How do governments align? How do they come together to agree on the appropriate mix of technologies and measures for combating a global threat?
Is that directed at me or Bernard?
Well, you actually, and then I thought I'd put it to Bernard as well.
Well, look, I think there's a number of ways we have to, we can do this. I mean, obviously there are non-governmental organizations that have been created to do just that, the Greta Thunbergs of this world, and who are having some impact. But I think also, that it's important that, and coming from 30 years at the World Bank and working with, in collaboration with the UN and other multilateral organizations, it's also important that there be an effort at the global level to engage multilateral and multinational, or multilateral, let's stick with government-owned agencies first, organizations in this fight against global warming. And we're not moving fast enough with respect to doing that. For instance, the World Bank continues to measure economic progress, as does the Asian Development Bank, as does the International Monetary Fund and others. They continue to measure progress in terms of GDP. It's the primary metric they use, an income-based metric for measuring progress, economic progress. And there are those, in fact, past chief economists, not least of whom Joe Stiglitz, but also people like Nicholas Stern in the UK, François Bourguignon in France, who are calling for the bank and other institutions to think in terms of a new development paradigm. Okay, so that's important to get the international institutions, because governments around the globe, especially those governments that borrow from these institutions, that come to them for financial support, will do what normally will do what they ask, what they suggest, as the sort of policy advice those institutions provide. And if they start saying to governments, look, you need to start measuring economic progress in much broader terms. You need to start looking at sustainability. You need to start looking at equity. And this can be done quickly, but it takes a decision again by the institutions. That would be major policy change by the World Bank, for example, and might require, although I don't think so, but it might require consulting with the board of directors, of course, who are the member governments. It would certainly require the endorsement of the leadership of the institution. So in the case of the World Bank, that would be the new president, David Malpass, who is a former U.S. Treasury Undersecretary of the U.S. Treasury appointed by Donald Trump. But that is important, and that can have an impact really in the short term. It's something which should be done now. It should be started now. Now, I should add that somebody like Mark Carney, whom you know in the UK, your former Bank of England governor and our former central bank governor in Canada, Mark has been appointed by the UN, by the Secretary General, to a position which will enable him to target financial instruments and investment as a tool for shifting financial resources into renewable energy and for weaning governments, weaning economies off fossil fuels. So that's important. So we need to engage people like the Mark Carneys of this world and the international financial institutions, I think. And then I think also, and the UN, of course, I include them. And then I think we need to do a better job, people like us, advocates, of exploiting, if I can use the term, natural or hydrometeorological disasters. We need to scare people, and we need to scare the public more, I think, and more effectively by really using these events more effectively and communicating their frequency, their intensity, and linking it to global warming, linking them to the causes. So I think that's important. And then I also think we need to promote the idea, and this gets into the political realm, and easier said than done, but what needs to be promoted is the idea of leaders, electing leaders, especially in democracies, who are driven by science and by expertise and by evidence and adopt evidence-based policy, okay? We need to be advocating the need for that kind of leadership in the 21st century, okay? I've written a column on this recently, that we can no longer think of foreign policy threats as we did in the 20th century, okay, where they are managed by traditional diplomats, okay, and transactional kinds of exchanges, and how the Canadian government, for example, how Canada is impacted by interaction between the two global powers. How do we position ourselves to take advantage and to be least affected by. We can't think in those terms. Yes, you've got to continue. I'm not saying you don't have to continue, but you need a clear two-track approach. One that thinks in those 20th century transactional terms, but today in the 21st century, a track that also thinks in terms of these global existential threats, what I called the inexorable trends, which are not only climate change, but also global pandemics, the demographic transition, and the increase in populations in certain parts of the world, and the rapid aging of populations in other parts of the world. And of course, artificial intelligence and robotization, which is going to render a lot of employment obsolete and destroy a lot of jobs. So I think we have to look at all of these as potential approaches.
Great, thank you. But Bernard, I want to ask you for your thoughts on that as well, but I also want to throw into the mix something which of course is very close to our core. On my website, in my company, NCW, I work with a lot of people coming out of an aerospace and defense background. I have an aerospace and defense reporting background myself, so I know the sector very well. And for some years, you know, I and my colleagues have been advocating a sort of core role for the aerospace and defense sector as a sector which has a global outlook. It is used to dealing with very large systemic problems. It puts together systems of systems solutions, often on regional, perhaps even global scales when you think about orbital and satellite-driven technologies. So in addition to expanding on what Joe has just said, do you have any thoughts too about the role that the aerospace and defense sector might be able to play in pulling together some of these technologies and systems that we've all been talking about?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to the things you've said, and you know, the work I've done in my career on space science, on scientific satellites, scientific spacecraft, has brought me in contact with people in this industry, and I have a high respect for the creativity of the people, their skill sets, and how much they love getting into something that is new and really solving problems. The economic model for this industry is based upon government money, because if you want to build a satellite, it's usually for science, for instance, it's NASA or the European Space Agency that goes to this industry and gets bids for development first, and then for building, and so it's not a proactive thing. It's something which fits very well with the model of going on a war footing, going out and spending money, and looking for an industry that can handle that money and bring you a return, bring you what you want. So it seems to me, for instance, this impacts the questions of which technologies are mature that you raised earlier, and which are not. If you have a mature technology, and to some extent, photovoltaics, solar energy is mature. It's certainly out there, and we can buy it in systems, and it's efficient. That's something where with mature technologies, you could rely on the manufacturing expertise of big industry to replicate it and distribute it and bring down the unit cost. So that's one aspect of it. But the areas which are not mature, where there are lots of ideas in the university sector, in the research institute sector, for example, about new ways of doing things, for instance, direct capture of carbon out of the air, which need investment, need people to look at it from a system point of view. You may have the science, but you can't know whether it's going to be something you want to deploy until you've looked at the whole system and costed it, and see, is this going to be able to remove carbon from the air at a cost that is reasonable and is going to assist us in making, for instance, airline flights carbon neutral. So that's a system issue. And these people have a lot of experience with things like that. So I think it's an unused resource, and it baffles me that government keeps going to the private sector for different kinds of solutions, keeps hoping the private sector is going to come up with it, when so much of the expertise is actually locked up in this particular industrial sector.
Well, thank you for that. That's a very interesting view from your perspective as a scientist. Joe, I wondered if you had any thoughts too on the potential role of the aerospace and defense sector in the midst of all of this activity that you outlined earlier. It is a sector, as Bernard's just said, that really only acts on the word of governments. So how might we get governments to sit up and take note of the fact that it has this asset at its disposal, and you know, get the aerospace and defense sector on the war footing that we've been talking about in the past hour?
It's very interesting, this point. And Bernard and I mentioned this to Bernard in a discussion we had earlier. The company, the board of which I chair, has been involved in South Africa initially in the COVID crisis. We helped the South African government, well, the government in the Western Cape, with procurement of PPE equipment early on. And we did so because a fellow member of the board, which I chair, is a Korean national who used to teach economics at Oxford. And his field of expertise is China. And he has very close links with the senior management of China Aerospace Industries. And we, on behalf of the South Africans, were able to help them procure PPE equipment directly from China Aerospace Industries, the company. You may recall that early on in the crisis, there were literally hundreds of Chinese companies that were manufacturing and exporting PPE equipment to deal with COVID. And a lot of that material was defective, was way over price or over cost of production, and was an embarrassment. As a result, was an embarrassment. In the UK, there were serious problems, as you recall, until Paul Dighton was hired. Was an embarrassment to the Chinese and to the Chinese brand. So in mid-April, April the 19th to be exact, the Chinese passed a law banning all but 21 companies from exporting PPE. And those 21 companies had to be NMPA compliant, which is the compliance standard of China, but also EC compliant. compliant with the European Union standards. Top of that list was China Aerospace Industries. And the reason, they have a huge department which is dedicated to manufacturing medical equipment and PPE. And obviously they have some of the top engineering minds in the world, certainly in China. They're the ones, as Bernard has said, who send satellites into space. So, and they deal with complex systems. And they, of course, understand the technologies better than anybody else in China. So I thought it was interesting that you raised this because, in fact, they're using the China aerospace industries in China as a major source of PPE equipment. So certainly, there's no reason they shouldn't be using aerospace industries to work on global warming and the technologies that can mitigate and deal with global warming. So I'm all for it. I think it's very important.
Well, look, you've both spoken passionately on the issue for engagement, the need for action, and quickly. I wonder, as we approach the end of this session, whether I could get your thoughts on next steps. You know, as you said, we talk a lot, governments and industry have spoken far too much about the issue, but the need for action is tantamount and it needs to be done quickly. Bernard, are there any next step thoughts, you know, even if you have to wave a magic wand, that would get you to a position where engagement can be meaningfully made by governments and other sectors to tackle this problem? How would you, what are your recommendations for next steps?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and Nick, I know you've been thinking about it yourself. I think we need to, at this point, need to raise awareness, if that's not too mild a term, of the problem and of the need for drastic action to find solutions across the board. And that we need to get that message to the highest levels of government. How we do that, it's maybe we need to marshal, have a rather simple manifesto or some other kind of document that embodies these ideas, and that people who have the ear of government, which clearly I don't. Joe knows more people like that, but we need to spread that right across the globe. So we need to have people getting on board some sort of statement showing agreement that the time has come to leave gradualist approaches behind and understand the severity and the urgency of the problem and do something much more radical.
Thank you. Joe, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with Bernard. I think this sort of approach, the idea of a manifesto and get you know, important people with high public profiles to engage and to endorse it is a good approach. I think one needs to keep in mind, however, that this is, you know, this could have fairly serious implications, and we're seeing what the implications could be in the context of COVID, in that people are presenting, and certain political leadership are presenting the dilemma as being a kind of a binary choice between retaining individual rights of people in society versus the collective well-being of society. It's either one or the other. And you're seeing it now in the United States with the Republicans and people going out carrying their weapons to protect their houses, and talking about the importance of individual rights and liberty and freedom, and the right not to wear masks and not to take the kinds of precautions and follow the sorts of behavioral protocols that scientists and the medical profession are saying are important. You're seeing that also in Europe, in parts of Europe, in the UK, and here, and even in parts of Italy, though less so, but elsewhere in Europe. So there is this danger that people will present this as I said, as a binary choice. And I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it is a binary choice, but there has to be a recognition that to some extent, individual rights and individual liberties will need to give way to some extent to collective responsibility. And that applies equally in the case of global warming, as it does in the case of COVID. People's consumption patterns are going to have to change. People are going to have to make different choices. The other element, which is we have to recognize, and that's why I focused on the economics profession, is this idea of neoliberalism being at the heart, the sorts of policies which are labeled neoliberal that the international institutions and governments have pursued for the last, really since the Chicago School, the mid-60s, early 70s. This idea of neoliberalism versus a more progressive approach, an approach in which government plays a much more proactive role, and which economists get nervous about because they, this is called industrial policy, and you've got governments making decisions about investment versus the private sector. That's a big no-no. But a lot of this is based on the work of people like James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on theory of public choices. And he was essentially perpetrating a lie, and he was quite open about this later. And the lie was that we need to convince people and convince societies that public services are best provided by the private sector, that the public sector is less efficient and will screw it up. And so increasingly, public services need to be provided by the private sector because they'll do so more efficiently, more cost efficiently and effectively than the public sector. Well, that's a lie, and it's proven to be untrue. But it dominates the thinking of many of our governments, certainly of the current government in the United States, and I would add the current government in the UK. And to some extent, it's dominated even governments, the current Liberal government in Canada, at least up until last week. Hopefully it will mark a change because, as you know, the finance minister resigned under some pressure. And the new finance minister is Christopher Freeland, who has hopefully a much more progressive approach, and has already announced that she intends to focus a much greater share of public expenditures on the environment and green economic development. So hopefully that's going to be more than just lofty rhetoric, and but they have to do that. Certainly in the case of Canada, which many people won't know, per capita terms, is the #1 emitter of fossil fuels or of greenhouse gases on the planet. In per capita terms, Canada emits more carbon dioxide, more GHGs into the atmosphere than any other country on the planet. And Canada is also, and this is not widely known, amongst the G7 countries, is the #1 in terms of subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. The share of subsidies from the Canadian budget, and when you include That's both direct subsidies and indirect subsidies, so through fiscal policy. Canada is the largest subsidizer of fossil fuels amongst the G7. So you know there are these vested interests, and you have to change, as Bernard said. You've got to change the mindset and convince governments that now is the time to make these adjustments. Now is the time to bite the bullet, and the sooner we do it, the less the less pain will be felt as we progress towards a fossil fuel free economy. The longer we wait, the more pain will be felt, and the harder it'll be, and the more costly it'll be. So I think what we've got to do through all these means is that you've mentioned, that Bernard has mentioned, is convince governments that there is a crying need to do these things now, and to do them in a robust and decisive way.
Nick, could I come in and
Yeah, please do.
make a concrete suggestion? Because we both have said it's a complicated problem, and you're trying to change the mindset of very powerful people who have, invested a lot in their current mindset. I would like to suggest that this idea of direct air carbon capture, of building technologies that will just take carbon out of ordinary air to compensate activities like flying or other kinds of activities, is one that may have maybe a tactical one, a tactical choice as one of the first that one would push for, because it has it will have a broad appeal, even across the political spectrum. It will be attractive to airlines. It'll be attractive to the companies in the sector we've been talking about that build the airplanes. It will be attractive to people who think we should be flying all over the place, and that's the way to sustain tourism and the whole economic model that the world seems to have built up. It has the potential to drive a wedge into what might otherwise be a wall of ignorance or not hearing what you're saying. So it might be a good first case for talking about government funding on a very large scale, going into companies that know how to handle funding and know how to produce technologies, and solve problems, and do system engineering, and come up with a result in a very few years. So it could be a test case for a much more broad evolution of those concepts.
While we're on the subject of carbon capture, sequestration, or capture, there are natural ways to do this as well. It's not just through technology. We can, and government fiscal policy and subsidies can be directed to encouraging retrofitting of cities rather than new building, rather than building new concrete structures, but retrofitting existing cities, putting rooftop gardens on apartment buildings, on office buildings, greening the buildings that we currently inhabit, and building structures that in effect become absorbers of carbon dioxide. I mean, we're not doing that, and we should be. And these are major contributors to the parts per million in the atmosphere. And policy, again, you're fighting with vested interests. The contractors and builders, people like Donald Trump, who want to build all these new buildings, and to hell with the environment. It's got nothing to do with them. So this is important as well, and how we design cities going forward is very important. They should be, designed more with how do we green and retrofit cities so that not only will they not contribute GHGs, but they will absorb carbon as well. So there are numerous ways we can do this, but these are not being talked about in a serious way. They are in some countries. They are in some countries, but not in the major contributors to GHGs.
Well, look, thank you both. We've covered a lot of ground. It's very clear that you've both got the bit between your teeth on this. As we close out, I just wondered if I could have a few short words from both of you on whether you are pessimistic or optimistic for the future. Bernard, a few words from you, if I may.
I think I'm by nature an optimist, and I think I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but not for a magic bullet, not for a reversal of fortunes back to the atmospheric conditions of my youth. I think we're going to have to expect to face big problems. And my optimism is that the problems are solvable. It's possible to handle the problems and deal with them, but only, as we've said, if we take them seriously and start investing in looking for the ways to do that. So that's where my optimism comes from.
Thank you. And Joe, the same question to you, if I may.
Pretty much the same answer. I would echo, although rather than being cautiously optimistic, I would say I'm hopeful. I'm not sure I'm cautiously optimistic yet. I am by nature also an optimist. But when I see the state of our politics and the fear that's being stoked by politicians who are really promoting regressive kinds of policies. And the problem is that they're promoting these sorts of policies in other sectors, but which have a negative impact on our capacity to deal with global warming. And that's why I think until the general public wakes up, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, you look at a country like Russia and Alexander Putin. I mean, how committed is he, and how committed is his government to dealing with global warming and the impact of global warming? I mean, do we see anything that's could make us optimistic? Anything coming out of Russia that could make us optimistic? And they're a major player. Now with China, I may be taking a contrary view. I think the Chinese are very shrewd and very Machiavellian, and I always like to think that yes, they're using a lot of coal. Yes, they continue to use a lot of fossil fuels, but yes, they are also investing very heavily in renewable energy and in the technologies to support and commercialize that renewable energy. And I've seen this on my own trips to China when I was last there in 2012, and where I was asked, in fact, to talk about the need for a new growth paradigm. And there was, and the new growth paradigm was what I referred to before, namely weaning ourselves. And there was a lot of support for this. And in fact, if you look at what the Chinese are doing today, in many parts of China, not just with the metric I mentioned, they are doing it. They are doing it already, and they are positioning themselves, technologically speaking, to dominate the fossil or the renewable energy technologies. And when the proverbial shit hits the fan, they will be in a position to profit from their dominance. That's what I like to think is happening, and there's evidence to the effect that is what is happening. So that gives me some hope. But otherwise, as I said, it's going to require some major changes in mindset and how you generate that political will to adopt these kinds of measures that we've been talking about, especially in some of our democracies, is a tough one.
Well, gentlemen, on that generally hopeful note, I am going to draw the conversation to a close. I just want to thank you both very much indeed for joining me for this hour plus of lively discussion and chat. And I look forward very much to our next meeting and our next encounter. Thank you both very much.